So ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I would like to thank CAN CGM for inviting us back today to kind of explain a little bit about the report that we've helped draw up based on the various roundtables. As Johan mentioned, there's myself and Marina Mokhtar. But before Marina gets into the detail, maybe I should just set a context a little bit of this report. Firstly, this report is really about capturing a whole of society approach, by which I mean that if you look at the participants of the roundtables, you'll see that it wasn't just government agencies and a few corporates, but we had NGOs, we had experts, we also had people coming along who could contribute to some of these ideas. And we think it's very important. It's very important to be able to demonstrate to the government that actually we as a society are fully behind what they intend to do. And in fact, we don't need to be told to do it. The other thing that these roundtables also helps with is to provide the government with another forum to test out some of their proposed policies or to get data points or feedback on some of the things that they intend to do. So first point, whole of society approach. The second point, of course, is that the roundtables have been extraordinarily successful. I think Sunita has mentioned the numbers of people involved. And so the plan for this year, 2022, is to widen the stakeholder reach. So we are planning together with CAN and CGM to basically meet up with stakeholders from the youth, from the royal houses, and also the states, because that's obviously a key player in some of these decisions. So that's something to look forward to. And then finally, just to emphasize, this is not a PwC consultant's report, by which I mean a consultant's report usually requires a fair bit of research and lots of alternative ideas and so on. That wasn't the mandate. The mandate was really to report proceedings. So it was, if you like, a little bit like reporting in the form of minutes. So that is why some of the views expressed could be considered a bit controversial, but that's fine, because the whole intention was really to try and capture as many views as possible so that the decision makers, the policy makers, at least had a sense as to what's going on. The other thing that I would say is that we have not tried putting words into people's mouths, nor have we tried to edit them. So with that context and in that setting, can I now hand over to Marina to take you briefly through the report. Marina?
Thank you, Dato Faiz. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a great pleasure to have been working closely with Datin Sri Sunita and her team, including Dato Sri Johan, in coming up with this report of proceedings. In fact, I have been to personally join in a couple of the roundtable sessions, and surely that's what has been mentioned by Dato Sri Johan. You don't just see industry leaders, you see competitors, you see NGOs, public sector, passionately talking towards the same goal. And this has actually, bring us a lot of positivity in terms of, how do we go towards this low carbon emissions pathway. And without further ado, I'll just share briefly what is in the report. And this has been put up and published in the CGM's blog, which you can actually have a read of the entire report. But what I will do today is just to share with you briefly what the contents of these reports are and key salient points in each of these roundtable findings. So in the report itself, we have the report objectives as well as, where we are heading towards as Malaysia, the whole of society, all of government approach, and each thematic findings that we find within the 4 sectors in this roundtable. So the 4 sectors, as mentioned earlier, were energy sector, property and construction, plantation, and telecommunications. And we've also added a chapter on LULUCF because, again, Malaysia, we are very privileged to have such great biodiversity, and we need to be able and to be conscious on how we manage this and not just think about how to reduce the emissions. So as mentioned, this was actually both CEO Action Network and Climate Governance Malaysia coming together, organizing this roundtable, which we mentioned earlier. And the objective of this report really, as what Dato Faiz mentioned, is to have knowledge bank within the CGM network as well to what have been discussed with the private sectors, the public sector, the NGOs, and it serves as a form of awareness as well in terms of what are the key issues that industries are facing and what are the areas of support that are needed by the private sector, and more importantly, what the commitments by the private sectors are, because it's not just about what the government can do for me, but what can I do for myself and the company. And this is really the first report of proceedings that we would like to share. So as mentioned earlier, we talk about, just awareness on sustainability and climate change has actually prompted a global response to tackle issue through policy and market solutions. And we Malaysians as well have announced carbon neutral Malaysia by 2050. We are pleased to inform that even in the RMK 12, there are clear targets, and as what Dato Sri Zaini Ujang have mentioned earlier, more pledges have been made. And again, this is a step towards the right direction. Inaction is no longer an option for us. We've seen what other countries have done. Yes, there are some that are a bit more advanced in terms of the commitment, but Malaysia is not too far behind. We have started in terms of having certain commitments, but what has been discussed across the roundtable is not for the sort of having clear policy directions, but it's about accelerating some of these towards action and towards implementation. And I will share with you in detail after this. What's important as well, we realize is that there are various stakeholders that are impacted by this climate change, and not just about getting their buy-in, but working together towards climate change. We don't just think about what we have in terms of the local government, the local councils, the SMEs, that what we mentioned about capacity building of the SMEs. But at the national level, we talk about the policies makers, we talk about some of the regulators as well as the NGOs, and of course the global level. There are foundations, investors, as well as other international institutions, NGOs, investors, who are already taking an action in terms of climate action plan, and this would definitely impact not just at the national level, but at the local level. Consequences of inaction, there are many that we have highlighted here. We don't only talk about just environment and climate related risk, but there are direct impact to the economy as well as the businesses and households. Hence why I mentioned it's not just about what the country's policies are, but the commitment of the big industry players like what Dato Sri Zaini Ujang mentioned, leading the way like Petronas, TNB, and PwC ourselves have pledged for net zero. And this, we know that there are impact to not just businesses, but also to households. We were quite unfortunate when there were very bad floods quite recently. And these are again a reminder to all of us that climate change is not just a global issue, it's not just a national issue, but it's an issue that comes close at heart. And implications of these risks are manifold. They're not just reputation, access to financing may be difficult. We have seen investors taking into account what are the ESG practices and the political risks that are of course increasing in terms of activism and because of awareness as well. So some of the thematic concerns that have been raised during the roundtable that affect these four key stakeholders are essentially one, basically towards the global level, the sharing of some of this thought leadership. How do we institutionalize some of these policy matters, the issues of carbon sinks and mega biodiversity? How do we look at the funds for sustainability agenda and utilizing more of these globally publicly available funds? On the public sector side, there were concerns about data transparency as well as unverified and untimely data. So a lot of discussions have been made about data-driven decision-making as well as policy-making. But again, this is something that is advocated by the private sector, which would help inform the policies, not just at the federal state, but the federal level, but also the state as well. And this is to avoid any conflicting or misaligned policies. Of course, with the private sector, clear framework and legislation is needed with support of financing. And at the people level, we talk about socio-economic challenges, we talk about issues on capacity building, as well as certain awareness when we talk about dependency on certain polluting sectors. So now I will share some of the thematic findings. As mentioned earlier, there were 14 roundtable sessions attended by over 4,000 attendees with 50 speakers across 4 industry sectors. And some of the high-level findings that we summarize across all the 4 key sectors, as I mentioned earlier, is there is that great importance of access to open and timely data. There is a point where we need more evidence-based information. So perhaps current legal frameworks can be looked at in terms of data sharing, the use of 4IR technology to advocate technology for good, as also a requirement that can help us improve and monitor the climate risks and enable us to respond quicker and more efficiently. And of course, the integration of the policies. Secondly, we talk about the urgency for government to provide policy signals and to lead the way. As I mentioned earlier, there were many policy that has been announced by the government. So it's about coordination of the implementation and of increase in accountability and how they can actually lead the way. Thirdly, as evident from this roundtable and the commitment that has been given by the CEOs themselves in participating in this, businesses are ready to step up. Some of the steps that the private sector are taking are not just applying to their own business plan, but they are looking at ways to innovate in use of technology on how they can actually manage their carbon emissions as well and do their part in increasing the education to the rakyat. Which is a good segue to the point number 4, which is encouraging behavioral changes. Climate change impact is becoming irreversible. Hence, the understanding of these issues are quite important. The advocacy and awareness have started a long time ago, but there are questions whether there are urgent needs to start more of a stick approach, not just the carrot approach. Of course, the 5th one, as I mentioned earlier, is not just about carbon emissions, it's about carbon sequestration as well. And we know that Malaysia, we have a lot of natural assets that can be proven effective for this. And hence we need to understand better on how the public and private sector, the federal and the state government can work closely to enhance and increase this resources. And finally, harmonization of laws and regulations. At the state and federal government, there are many questions, legality that may be an issue, but we are all on a learning pathway, and hence this roundtable is also an avenue and a platform to understand what are the best practices in helping with climate change. So with that, I will then go briefly to each of the key salient points of each sector. I understand that if you need more information, the details of it are in the report as well. So with the energy sector, again, we like to acknowledge some of the roundtable participation here, not just from industry, we have from the federal ministry, agencies, and also other bodies like the World Bank, ICs, RIMA, and Sawi University. That shows that even youth and NGO are participating in this. Energy sector is always one of the key sectors when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, so it can't be ignored. We talk about the issues of subsidies for gas and fuel, and some of the key themes that have arisen here is that, again, really long-term policies exist, but should be implemented. Some of the examples that were given here are the low carbon mobility blueprint and the national energy policy. The thematic recommendations that come with the energy sector, there were 4 key thematics with other recommendations. One is on the increased share of renewables in energy mix. When we talk about increased penetration of renewables, we have the national energy policy. It's time to actually look at how to implement it and what are the issues that's stopping some of the implementation. Secondly, we talk about the long-term power market structure. The roundtable participants discussed about MESI Reform 2.0 that was again under review due to post-COVID that would actually help to enable penetration of renewable energy and greener generation. Secondly, the roundtable group discussed about electrifying the economy, transport as key focus. We've talked about this a lot about increasing electrification and efficiency of road transport, but what are the other barriers that needs to be removed? It may include certain policies around EVs or even the supply chain when it comes to EV and the transport sector. Thirdly, it's about accelerating development and uptake of new low or zero carbon fuels. There are various research that have been done out there with our universities and institutions which look at new technologies like hydrogen, circular economy. Again, the research and innovation is another avenue that has to be encouraged within the private sector together with our local universities and youth to basically harness technology for good. And fourth, about removing remaining emissions through engineered solutions or nature-based. We always talk about, how can we have solutions that are man-made, but we also need to think about how can we have solutions which are nature-based. And that is where they were talking about carbon capture and utilization as well as carbon storage industry. And finally, about conserving and enhancing forests. It's time for us to relook the value of our forests and understand how this can be put a price, quote unquote, to better understand the impact to our economy as well. Other thematic recommendations that were discussed were about public-private partnerships, carbon pricing to incentivize low-carbon solutions. We talk about awareness and communication to the public, as well as mandatory carbon accounting and disclosure, because actions is nothing without accountability. And it's surprising to say that you hear this from the private sector who's voluntarily asking for mandatory disclosure. Next sector is the property and construction sector. Again, thanks and a great acknowledgement to all the participants. We had WWF as well as the TRCRC and other associations in this property and construction sector. The carbon footprint of this sector is not just about construction, because it's a whole value chain that they were talking about, from materials, manufacturing, construction to operation of buildings. We mentioned the National Low Carbon Cities Master Plan earlier that already promote 5-year plan for low carbon cities, and 33 cities were selected to achieve carbon neutrality. So this is again a good step towards the right direction. And some of the policy recommendations that were discussed with this team are basically, number one, reducing operational and embodied carbon impact. Some of the solutions that were discussed were about energy efficiency, having mandatory energy audit, re-looking at the kind of materials that can be used. Again, innovation comes into play when we talk about what can be replaced in terms of the construction products, the byproducts, and how do we manage the waste materials. Secondly, as what Dr. Zaini Uja mentioned, is governance. Governance and awareness of sector GHG emissions. So a couple of key points that we talk about here is not just governance, the ability to understand and to have the capacity to manage this governance, and also the understanding of what data we need to have and we need to collect in order to understand better how we can actually action upon some of these issues. And finally, conserving biodiversity and natural carbon sinks. Not only we promote conservation of biodiversity in buildings and infrastructure plans. But also I think Plan Malaysia talks about having a green plot ratio to make sure that we actually have green spaces when we actually have certain planning that can also reduce urban heat island effect, right, in all developments. Again, these are some regulatory actions that can be taken within these sectors to actually help reduce carbon emissions. The next slide basically talks about the plantation sector. Again, these are the participants of those roundtable. We'd like to say thank you very much to those participants. Again, it's nice to see even competitors speaking to each other. And within the plantation sector, there were a lot of discussions about the extensive use of biomass sources as renewable energy potential. There were also a lot of discussion that talks about innovation in certain production techniques to reduce carbon and water footprint, and certain how can companies capitalize on efficient usage of natural resources. So some of the policy recommendations that were given by the plantation sector were again about increasing the share of renewables in energy mix using their bio-based renewable. Secondly is how they can efficiently use their natural resources when we talk about the plantation sectors. Thirdly is about innovation. How do they actually integrate innovation to their production process, and how they can efficiently use some of the byproducts and waste management. And finally, when we mention about legislation and framework, similar to what we have shared earlier in some of the other sectors, introduce some form of carbon pricing or even shadow pricing to incentivize low carbon solutions. Again, mandatory carbon accounting and disclosure, and revisiting the supply chain by integrating the role of middlemen. I think underpinning all of these basically the availability of data for them to understand where the issues lie. And the last sector is basically the telecommunication sector. Again, we can see that all the big telco companies, even the CEOs themselves, were in the roundtable, and they were very passionate about this discussion as well. And their role is not just about how they can reduce their carbon emission, but how they can play a critical role in spreading awareness and encouraging behavioral changes to the population. That's because everyone has a mobile phone, everyone is connected, and during times of crisis, they are the first ones to reach the population. So their role not just in behavioral changes, to again educating consumers, innovation, not just for themselves, but also how they can help consumers make smart choices, and again, data capture. So some of the recommendations that were discussed were, one, of course, how they can reduce emissions from their own operations. So when we talk about data centers and how they can optimize energy efficiency while reducing emissions. And we're proud to say that even TMB themselves have incorporated within their business plan on how they can actually optimize energy efficiency. And there are other telco companies that talk about green energy as an alternative. Secondly, they talk about helping consumers and businesses make the right choice. I think what was mentioned was we are in the society of always on today. Our laptop is always on, our mobile is always on. That all requires energy. And they are, because they are with you all the time, and help to educate the consumers to make better informed decisions, and to invest in new innovation on how consumers can make smarter choices. And of course, finally, how they can actually build resilience for times of crisis. As I mentioned, during the flood or any crisis for that matter, sometimes telco companies are one of the key companies that needs to be there in times of crisis, because they need to be reached. And again, that is why they actually have access to some of the key data that can help to enable behavioral changes. So again, these are some of the commitments, or some of the recommendations that were coming from the private sectors in coming together with the government as well as society on how they can actually move towards a low carbon emissions pathway. And finally, on LULUCF, again, we thought that this is a very critical information and point to take note within this roundtable report as well. Hence, we talk about increasing accountability and management of data on LULUCF, how we can actually leverage on our natural assets that we have, and look through a whole of government and society approach in participating through this LULUCF. So we talk about data reporting. I've mentioned about enhancing carbon sequestration, how do we innovate and utilize, and of course, harmonise and the legislation, both at the federal and state level. And of course, what's also important is capacity building at the state and local authorities level. Then with that to also broaden the stakeholder participation. With that, I conclude the summary of the findings. Again, this is just the summary. And again, I would like to thank all those who were participating in the roundtable and who have spent their time to bring this report together. Thank you very much.